friends, it's the Stitches. Today we're gonna talk about commercial patterns. And I have a new one and an old one I'm gonna show you today. But I wanna cover everything you would need to know about patterns, from picking them out, to buying them, to using them, and all of that stuff. So before we get into those, let's first talk about the buying process. So the first thing that you need to know about commercial patterns is that they are incredibly overpriced. Most pattern companies only produce a small handful of new patterns every year, and they're well known for carrying the same patterns for decades. And yet each one is still $15 to $16 starting, and a lot of them are now over $20. So with small pattern companies, it kind of makes sense because usually it's just one, maybe 2 or 3 people running the whole company. And smaller companies actually tend to really put the work in to produce a perfect, beautiful pattern for you. Usually also making something that's pretty unique that you wouldn't be able to find elsewhere. But you should never pay that much for, say, a simplicity pattern, especially when they're not really that far deviated from the standard slopers that simplicity uses. So each pattern is basically the same pattern with just a few small variations. The fabric store Joann's usually has sales on patterns pretty regularly. At least once a year, brands like Simplicity, Butterick, and McCall's will go for sale for 99 cents each. And even more frequently, usually once a quarter at least, they'll go on sale for $1.99 each. And Joann's is not the only store that does this. Pretty much anywhere that carries patterns will have these sales. So definitely sign up with your local fabric stores for their like coupon books and their like sale guides. Usually there's like an email they put out. If you're building your fabric stash and building up your collection of basic notions and patterns and things like that, you definitely want to keep an eye on those sales. In order to buy patterns, you can't actually just go and find all the patterns laid out. You have to actually know what you're looking for. And all of the patterns will be in these like drawers inside the store, and you have to like pull the drawer out and find your pattern, and they're all done in numeric order. Each pattern will have a number. So this one is M5888. So this will be found in the M58s, wherever those are in the drawer. At the fabric store, there will be catalogs that will have every single pattern available in it. So every pattern that could be in the drawer is in that book. And you could go to the store when there's a sale going on and flip through the book, but I find that it saves a lot more time to just go to the manufacturer's website, look at all of the patterns that they have, and then just write the numbers down somewhere. I keep a list on my phone. That way when a sale does pop up, you're prepared and you can just go to the drawer, find the numbers that you already wrote down, and then you don't really have to spend a whole lot of time at the actual store. So the next thing you want to know about commercial patterns is that they use non-standard amounts of ease and seam allowance. Each commercial pattern will have a 5/8 inch seam allowance, but 5/8 inch is not standard anywhere else. It is only standard in home sewing, and no professional sewing uses 5/8 inches. So if you're using a handmade pattern, you can't just kind of Frankenstein that to a commercial pattern. You have to actually change around some stuff and make sure that you pay special attention to how much ease and seam allowance are in it. Also, when you buy a pattern, make sure that you pay attention to the measurements that are given on the pattern. So on the McCall's patterns, there will be some sizes on the top, and it will tell you what the waist and the hip measurement for each of those sizes are, so that you know what size that you need to cut out, because they are not the same as the sizes that are on finished garments. And unfortunately, McCall's doesn't actually have, at least not on this one, any finished garment measurements, but Simplicity, which is like one of the most popular brands because they're the most beginner friendly, usually does. It gives a finished bust measurement because these are just some bodysuits, so they're meant to be knit. It doesn't have a full range of measurements, but it does say that the finished garment measurements for a bust on this is 26.5 inches. But for the actual body measurements, the bust should be 31.5 inches, and that's for an extra small. So pay attention to the difference in measurements. Since this is a knit, it would make sense that the measurement would be smaller. If there's more than 5 or 6 inches of ease in between the garment measurements and the body measurements, there's gonna be a lot of bulk and you might not want that. If you're making, say, a cotton dress shirt, the bust measurement should have a lot of give because you'll need to move around in that garment. But if you're making a more tailored garment, like a dress bodice, or if you're making something out of stretchy fabric, you don't want 5 to 6 inches of ease because it'll just look really bulky and like it doesn't fit you correctly. Most patterns will say what type of fabric they expect you to make the pattern out of. But you know, sometimes you want to use a pattern with a different fabric, and you can absolutely do that. You just might have to change, you might have to trim it in here or there, or you might have to let it out in a few different places. So keep that in mind when you're cutting your fabric out. When in doubt, always make a mock-up. If you have not used this particular pattern yet before, please make a mock-up. You can buy some cheap sheets from Goodwill. They can even be stained and full of holes and cost 99 cents because you're never gonna need to wear the garment. But you definitely want to check the fit of a pattern before you're cutting it out of something that might be $15 to $40 a yard. So when you do get your pattern, make sure that you cut out each piece very carefully and that you read your instructions before you cut anything out. Read your pattern instructions all the way through so that you know exactly how the garment needs to be put together before you actually cut it out and start putting it together. It's like you want to have a game plan in place before you actually start doing anything that might cost you money, you know? Your pattern instructions will even give you a list of every single piece that's in the pattern, and it will give you guides on how to cut it out of different types of fabric. So the instructions are your Bible. Pay attention to them. They will tell you everything that you need to know. And then aside from the pattern instructions, the patterns themselves actually have their own set of instructions on them. Once you get more comfortable with how patterns fit together and how different garments are constructed, usually the pattern itself will be able to tell you everything that you need to know. But when you're first starting out and you don't instinctively know what the shape of a bust line looks like, then you might need to pay more attention to the actual instructions. So this is our McCall skirt pattern. This is from the early 2000s or whenever I was in high school. And this is pattern piece number 1. And you can see that it has different grades for the different sizes, and then it has arrows that tell you which size. So this goes from size 4 all the way up to a size 12. It only appears that there's like an inch of difference between the sizes, but you'd be surprised at how much that inch makes a difference when it comes to fitting. Then it also has some dots and stuff. This is used for fitting the pieces together. And then we have these little arrows. This is called a notch, and this is also used for fitting the pieces together. So when you put your pattern pieces together, you'll have notches that sort of guide how they're supposed to fit. And then on the edge here, we have some instructions that tell us to cut this on a fold. Not only does it tell you like what it is, it has the brand and the number of the pattern written on it. It has the actual pattern piece number, and then it has what it actually is and how many of it you should cut. So it says this is the yoke front for styles A and B, which are the only 2 styles in this envelope. And if you're cutting the A lace, the overlay, then you only need to cut 1. And then for the rest of the fabric, you need to cut 2 of your regular fabric. And then for view B, you need to cut 2 of just whatever fabric you're cutting B out of. Because the only difference between A and B in this pattern is that A has a lace overlay and B doesn't. So your pattern piece will give you a lot of vital instruction as well. If you lose the instructions to your pattern, then your pieces should be able to tell you enough that you can roughly figure out what needs to happen. This pattern, however, is a vintage pattern, and vintage patterns look a lot different from regular patterns. In fact, I prefer vintage patterns. I wish that pattern companies would go back to doing what they used to do on vintage patterns, but let's give you a bit of a comparison. So the first difference is obviously that this is made out of a far superior quality tissue than this one. Like, you can see that this one is a little bit more transparent than this one. And it's not just because this one is older and yellowed a little bit, but this is actually made out of a much thicker tissue paper. I don't know why we don't, like, pattern prices have only skyrocketed, but the quality of the actual patterns has only gone down. But the biggest difference is that this actually has a sort of dashed line going all around of it. That is your stitching line. This only has a cutting line, so it doesn't show a stitching line, it doesn't show how much seam allowance is on this, it only has a cutting line for our new pattern. But our old pattern it actually shows you sectioned out that this is the seam allowance and then this is the actual pattern on this side. So it'll have the dark line around, and that's your actual cutting line. That's where you cut out both the pattern and the fabric, but then it also has this other line that you can actually mark on your fabric where you're supposed to stitch. Nowadays, if you want to create a stitching line, you have to read your pattern and see how much seam allowance is in it, and then actually take a seam gauge and some chalk and mark around and make your own seam line on it. But the vintage patterns did all of that work for you already. And honestly, like, it's just, I think it's like 1 or 2 buttons on Vector. Like, the difference, it's such a minimal amount of effort that the pattern company had to put in, but for some reason we just don't do it anymore. So I accidentally chose 2 pattern pieces that don't have grain lines on them. Let me see if I can find one that does. So you can see a like arrow line on here. This shows the grain line, and that tells you what direction you're supposed to cut your piece out on. So when you buy fabric, there's like the warp and the weft, and that's how it's woven together. Or with knit fabric, it's just like the different lines of knit, and then you'll have like, it won't be a warp and a weft, but it'll still be like a stretchy end and a not as stretchy end. So there's definitely like a right way to cut pieces out and a wrong way to cut pieces out. This one doesn't have a grain line on it, but it also says to cut it on the fold. And then this also has a dart marked in it. We do darts pretty much the same way, except nowadays we don't really have the arrows anymore. We don't have these lines, we just have the 3 dots. But this still has the brand, the pattern number, the actual piece number, and what it is. This is a back yoke. It tells you where you can adjust stuff. So this right here is where you would adjust for the shoulder length. And then it also tells you right on it how much the seam allowance is. So it says 5/8 inch seam allowance. It also has the notches so that you can match your pieces together. I wanted to show you a back piece, a piece that had both a back and a front, because on the back there will be two notches, and on the front there is 1 notch. And that's how you can tell the back from a pattern piece from the front of a pattern piece, because this is supposed to fit like right here basically. So this notch, the front notch, shows that that's where you connect the front piece of fabric to it, and then the back notch shows you where you're connecting it to the other center back piece. So definitely read the pattern itself as well as the instructions. That way you get a really full, clear picture of what you're supposed to do with your pieces once they're cut out. And if anything in the instructions seems unclear, the pattern itself and the markings on the pattern will usually be able to clear up anything that might seem confusing as well. Once you have used a few commercial patterns and you get more comfortable with them, don't be afraid to experiment with them and maybe Frankenstein pieces together. Most brands will work off of the same slopers for all of their pieces, so pretty much every Simplicity sleeve is gonna fit pretty much every Simplicity bodice as long as they're the same size. Same with McCall's, same with Butterick, like all of their pieces will pretty much fit into each other as long as there's nothing weird design-wise going on. And even if it isn't perfect and exact, any alterations you might have to make them fit will be incredibly minor and incredibly easy and usually pretty self-explanatory to do. It's a really easy way to get into pattern altering. And it helps you get the most out of a smaller overall number of patterns. Once you have a perfectly fitted dress pattern that you know fits you well, you can use that fitted dress to make all kinds of other dresses if you just know how to maybe put a bodice on a different skirt or add a sleeve or do anything like that. You can also add your own collars and your own pockets. You can add piping to literally any seam. You can add lace overlays to any pattern piece if you just flatline them together. You can do literally whatever your imagination wants you to do because patterns are basically just a blank canvas for you to use to make whatever garment art you want to make. Commercial patterns are definitely how I originally learned how to make clothing, and being able to fiddle with them and, you know, put this bodice on this dress and add these sleeves and then add this collar from this other pattern over here is where I really learned to get creative with making garments and sort of opened the door for me learning how to design garments from scratch. And then obviously just having these well-made patterns that were designed to fit with each other really helped me learn the anatomy of pattern making so that when I was ready to finally start making my own patterns, I already knew basically what the shapes were supposed to look like, so I could easily tell that this line is way off, or this line, this measurement can't possibly be correct because it's supposed to look like this. I need to remeasure this. It really helps to have a clear idea in your mind what pattern anatomy is supposed to look like before you actually start drafting things from scratch, because that's a whole nother beast that I'm not super comfortable with teaching at this present moment. So that's all for today's video. I hope this was informative and educational and mildly entertaining. And I hope anybody who is getting into sewing is a little bit more comfortable now getting their own commercial patterns. I hope everybody has a good day, and I will see you all next time. Bye!